Today I'm building this two-way stand mount loudspeaker with sbacoustics 6-inch woofer, a CS waveguide tweeter and a passive radiator. So this is the passive radiator by sbacoustics that I'm going to be mounting on the back of the loudspeaker. And as you can see, this is what we call a racetrack design. It's 5 by 8 inches. It's not round, and as a result of that, it poses us with a bit of a challenge. How do we actually flush mount this? How do we cut the hole for it? Now I can just cut one hole with a jigsaw and mount it in the baffle like that. So it's not flush, but I want this to look quite neat, and I want to flush mount it. Essentially, the racetrack shape of the passive radiator is just two identical circles spaced apart and connected in the middle with a rectangle, giving us the racetrack shape. I start off by marking the positions of the two circles based on the overall length and width of the passive radiator, and then drill the two holes for my circle cutting jig to register in. I then cut the two circles and also adjust the diameter so that my 1/4 inch router bit can cut the width of the rebate for the flange of the passive radiator. The second cut is for the inside mounting hole all the way through, and again I do this for both circles. And then finally I use a piece of off-cut wood as a straight edge and set it up to line up with the edges of the circles. I use a flush cut router bit to complete the shape for both the rebate and through hole. So that took a little bit longer than cutting a normal round hole for a round driver, but I think it came out alright. It's not 100% perfect, as you can see, but when I put in the passive radiator, the gaps around it are slightly uneven, but I think it still came out alright. So that's the result. Like I said before as well, you can also just cut the hole with a jigsaw and it'll end up looking like that, and then the passive radiator just drops in and you can screw it to the baffle. That's perfectly fine. It'll work exactly the same whether it's as the flush mounted version. Here I'm using the same procedure as I used for cutting the hole for the passive radiator to cut the holes for the tweeter with waveguide and for the 6-inch woofer. This is the brace panel that will secure the side panels and help to counter any cabinet vibrations and resonances. I start out by marking out the shapes to be drilled and cut out. Now that I've finished out marking out the brace, I'm going to go over to the drill press and I'm going to use a 40mm Forstner drill bit to drill out these holes. Then I'm going to come back here to the workbench and we're going to use a jigsaw to cut out the rest of the holes and to complete the braces. I use a ruler and a pencil to draw a line between the circles to indicate where to make the cutouts with a jigsaw. I'm now going to use my least favorite tool, the jigsaw, to cut out the rest of the brace. Let's do it. This step is not essential, but I mostly like it when the cutouts in the brace has a slight bevel or round over. Whether it does anything to counter staining waves or resonances in the cabinet is debatable, and you can discuss it in the comments below if you want to, but at least I don't have to read various comments on the subject and why I have not done this, because it's now done. So now that I have all the parts that needed to be cut, drilled or routed, we can start assembling the cabinets. But I'm going to leave that till tomorrow, so I'll see you back here then. So it's the next morning and we're going to start assembling the enclosure. I have side panels and then I have top and bottom panels. The first thing to do is to mark on the sides of the side panels where the braces are going to be attached. So I'm going to mark that line on this side, and then because I'm going to be using brad nails to fix this enclosure together, on the opposite side of the panel I'm going to make a line so that I know where to position those brad nails. Assembly of the enclosures are simple butt joints with wood glue and brad nails to secure the panels together. I did have some issues with my brad nailer where I would get constant jams and the nails just not shooting out. Not sure if this is a pressure problem or the nail gun itself. I have been contemplating getting a cordless battery powered brad nailer in the hope that this will solve my problem, but for now I am powering on with this one. Even though I secure the panels with brad nails, it is still essential to clamp it all together to get a really good bond. The brad nails are really just used to keep the panels together until I can clamp it. After filling all the nail holes with wood filler, I give the entire enclosure a sanding with a 100 grit sandpaper on my orbital sander. To seal the MDF, I use a sanding sealer. There are many brands around, but I will link one or two in the description below. Two coats of sanding sealer is applied while waiting about 1 hour in between coats and sanding it on a slower speed with 320 grit sandpaper with the orbital sander. I also go over the edges with fine sandpaper to make sure they are smooth. I 3D printed these plastic pyramids, and they are a great way to get your enclosure off the worktop for painting. I will leave a link to the STL files in the description below. So the enclosure is assembled, and we need to take measurements with the drivers inside so that we can model the crossover. But before I can do that, I need to mount the tweeter to the waveguide. Now this is a waveguide from Visiton, and this is the tweeter that I'm using from CS, and the two are not compatible in terms of mounting holes. So let's see what I'm going to do to make these up and mount the tweeter to the waveguide. So you can see that I've assembled this one. I've not secured it with any screws or bolts yet. This is only secured with some double-sided tape just to position it. And then what I'll do is I will drill holes and secure the tweeter to the waveguide with a few bolts. So I'll show you how I did this with this one. I'm just going to start by taking some like thin double-sided tape, and I'm going to be laying it onto the tweeter here. So I'm just beating that off, and then I'm going to stick some more, and essentially what we're doing is we're creating a bit of a square around the tweeter dome. Right, so this is where we need to be quite accurate. As you can see, we have the 4 mounting holes there on the back of the waveguide, but like I said, they don't fit. But we don't want to line them up with those, otherwise we won't be able to drill holes in the waveguide to mount the tweeter. So we need to twist it slightly so that it's a little bit off center. So I'm just going to lay it down like that. I'm going to line up these holes with those holes, and then just twist it slightly that way, maybe about 10 or 15 degrees, and then we want to very, very carefully just drop this down onto the tweeter faceplate, and this is going to be by eye, but you can get it quite accurate. Alright, so that looks alright. So what I'm also doing is I'm just turning it in the light just to try and see if I've got an even spacing between the tweeter and the waveguide, and if I'm happy with that, and I think that's looking good. Maybe a little bit that way. I'm going to press it down. Right, so I'm just turning it around and I'm just pressing it down nice and firmly. And to me that is looking good. If you're off by you know, 0.1 of a millimeter here or there, I don't think it's going to make much of a difference. Right, so there we have it. I think that's about as close as we're going to get. Right, so now on to drilling some holes and securing them with bolts. So I'm actually using a brad point drill bit. It's a woodworking bit, but it'll drill through plastic easily enough, and that is just to make sure that my the hole gets centered as I drill through. Now I've actually drilled these already, but I'm just going to clean up the hole. I'm using a pencil to make a reference mark on the tweeter and the waveguide, and then after removing the double-sided tape I can then line up the tweeter and the waveguide exactly, making sure that the holes that I drilled are lining up. I'm cutting a thin strip of self-adhesive weather strip. This will be applied between the waveguide and the tweeter faceplate, and we'll just make sure that we get a good airtight seal. I can then place the tweeter on the waveguide, just making sure that my reference lines line up, and then that my holes are corresponding to each other. Cool. Now the waveguide does come with some screws. These are M4 screws, so all you need are just some M4 nuts. So these are just going to go through, and I'm going to use a long nose pliers, squeeze the nut in between, and this is where it might become a little bit tricky. So just grabbing the screw with the screwdriver, and then lining the nut up, and there we go. I'm not tightening them all the way at the moment. So I'm doing the one on the opposite side as well. Right, so it looks like we're still aligned. We can continue with the last two screws. Right, so that was maybe a little bit more trickier than I thought, but it went fairly smoothly. So I've got the tweeters fixed to the waveguides, and I can now go over to mount these together with the woofer and the passive radiator in the enclosure, and I can model, or I can actually measure each driver and then go over and model a crossover for this loudspeaker. The crossover turned out to be a second order on the tweeter and the woofer, and both drivers were very easy to shape into place. The crossover point is roughly 1.5 kHz, and when looking at the inverse graph, we get a very good reverse null at the crossover point, indicating good integration between the two drivers. The impedance is a nominal 6 ohm. All the components for the crossover are secured to a 6mm MDF board with cable ties. You can also use some hot glue together with the cable ties for more secure fix to the board. All the components are then soldered together according to the schematic diagram, and wires are attached that goes to the binding post and to the different drivers. So I've given the enclosure 2 coats of sanding sealer, and I've sanded in between with 320 grit sandpaper, and then also after the second coat I've sanded again with 320 grit sandpaper. This gives us a very nice smooth finish, and it seals the MDF. I'm now going to go and coat it with a filler primer, and this will just make sure that we cover any imperfections in the surface of the enclosure. I will probably do 2 or 3 coats of filler primer, and in between I will sand with 500 or 600 grit water sandpaper, and that'll give us a really nice smooth finish, and we'll be able to see if there are any imperfections left in the surface, and then we can go over and we can cover it with our color or our top coat, and then after the top coat we will do a clear coat. Now that the enclosures have been painted and left to cure for a few days, I'm on to the final steps in the assembly process. I use a 12mm or half-inch felt cut to size to line the interior walls of the enclosures. The felt is glued on with wood glue. I line all the inside panels except for the front baffle and a section on the bottom panel where I will be securing the crossover board. Luckily the driver openings are fairly large, so it is easy to get the glue bottle in there and slide the felt into position. After the glue has dried, the drivers are put in place and positions marked where to drill the pilot holes for the mounting screws. The binding post has these small tabs that I can solder the input wires of the crossover board to, after which I mark out the position of the binding post and then drill the holes. The binding posts are then secured with the washer and the nut before we can continue to connect the crossover board. The crossover board is secured with a few strips of double-sided tape. You can also glue these more permanently with a 2-part epoxy as a more secure fixing solution. And the input wires with the tabs I pre-soldered earlier are secured to the binding post with washers and nuts before we continue to wire and screw the drivers in place. The tweeter is the CS22 TFF on a visit on WaveGuide, and the 6-inch woofer is the sbacoustics 16 PFCR 25 8-ohm version. Both are considered lower budget drivers in terms of their respective brands lineup, but they perform well above what I would consider low budget. In my opinion, these offer excellent performance and value for the money. A folded strip of damping material is inserted just above the crossover, making sure not to obstruct the passive radiator. This is the only other damping material apart from the felt that is required for this build. The final part of the puzzle is to mount the passive radiator, and then we are ready to take a listen, and I will also take a few measurements to confirm my design goals. I think these look stunning and I love the blue paint. This is not a very complicated build, and if you want to build a pair like this for yourself, then you can purchase the build plans on my website at soundblab.net. So check the link in the description below. These loudspeakers are some of my favorite stand mounts I've built. It's very easy to listen to and has very clear mid-range and top end. It never feels like it shouts or becomes fatiguing. It is smooth and perhaps the mid-range is slightly forward sounding, but with very good sound stage and imaging when towed in about 15 to 20 degrees to your listening position. The bass is powerful, and even though it has a dB or so elevated in this region, it still has definition and is not boomy at all. The speaker will need 1 or 2 feet from all walls, and if you can bring them further into the room, even better. These are some of my measurements of the actual speaker. I'm not going to provide an explanation, but you can pause and have a look and make up your own mind. The one thing to notice though, in the cumulative spectral decay graph, is very good off-axis response across the frequency band. Thank you all for watching. Check out my Patreon and YouTube membership pages where I upload behind the scene and more detailed content at least once a week, and consider supporting me through these platforms. Please like, comment and subscribe on this video, and until next time, adios. Let's take a listen to a sound demo best listened to through good headphones.
Si no de noche de día, si no pregunta tu almohada, o los gritos que escuchaban los vecinos, no te trago pero qué rico se vino, agua dulce baby puro manantial. You wanna hold, don't hold back, oh, your little dramas got me mad, and I don't need to tell you facts, you know I always want you back. I can't be the one you keep running to whenever you feel down. I can't be that someone who'll always be there when something's wrong. I can't rely on you now. I can't rely on you anymore. I can't depend on you.
The gentle April rain that stained the window panes last night is all but gone, but lingers on in scented clouds of air. We watch the town awaken to the trembling